You talk about some of these darker end games, Colonel. You talk about maybe an embargo here in the UK. You've also talked about potentially Russia and China moving into the cartels in Mexico and empowering them, and you said we could be looking at a scenario like the Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids, where there are locations very close to America that are now being backed by all these foreign regimes. Can you talk about what you mean by that and how that would happen? Well, remember the Ukrainians have already managed to resell weapons from the United States, including Javelin missile systems and others, through the arms bazaars run out of places like Kosovo to various bad actors, if you will. We've seen them now show up in Mexico. We've seen people walk around with Javelin missiles there. The Mexican cartels, frankly, are better armed in most cases than the Mexican armed forces. This is not a good thing. The cartels, and we've seen this so many times in the past, where political forces and criminal elements, organized crime, come together in an alliance for temporary benefit. We saw the IRS work closely with various Islamist groups and actually find their way into the Caribbean as well. In Mexico right now, not only Hamas, but also a large and growing population of Muslim Arabs. Many of whom are radicalized, not all of them by any means, but many. The drug cartels are in it for the money. Now, they don't really want to attack us, but if you offer them enough money and create the incentive, particularly in view of the fact that we are not defending our borders, we are allowing people we don't know to walk into our country and then receive benefits that our own citizens don't get. It's not very difficult to believe that that's an open, gaping wound into which a great deal of salt can be poured quickly. We haven't even talked about Cuba and Venezuela or perhaps other countries in Central America that are anti-American, hostile to us for a whole range of reasons. Some of which, by the way, are legitimate if you go back far enough. Nevertheless, those are opportunities for the Russians to start multiple fronts that we have to deal with. We seem to have ignored that, and then of course, you have our favorite friend in North Korea. North Korea has always been much closer to Moscow than to Beijing. To be frank with you, Xi and Beijing don't like North Korea. Most Chinese don't like North Koreans. They don't even like Koreans, but they certainly don't like North Koreans. It is seen as a destabilizing element. The Chinese would like to get rid of it. That's why there was an opportunity under Donald before he left office to come to an arrangement to denuclearize North Korea, with the goal ultimately of making the South, the Republic of Korea, the caretaker for the North. And the Chinese would be quite happy to do that. They do a land office business with South Korea. South Korea, Japan, China, all do a land office business in Taiwan with the microcircuitry industry. I mean, Asia is a different place from where we live. Asians don't think like us. They're not interested in any major wars right now. Nobody wants one. But that doesn't mean that the arrival of new rocket bodies and new rocket engines inside North Korea would not spark a crisis. You know, whatever they have in North Korea has come from Russia when it comes to rocket technology. Weapons technology hasn't come from China. You mentioned the borders. I saw presidential candidate Robert Kennedy down at the borders recently, and Colonel, I was shocked. I grew up on the border in San Diego, and back then, it was probably Mexicans coming over the border. Then later, we saw Central Americans coming over the border. I think when Kennedy was there, it was like a cornucopia of the United Nations, like Africans and Muslims and people from the Middle East. I was shocked. I didn't realize that people were traveling to Mexico from all over the world just to get into America. What does that mean for the longer-term breakdown of the U.S. and security and all that? Well, let's look at it carefully. I've always liked the law that the Austrians passed years ago that said, until every Austrian who wants to work and can work, we will not admit anyone else to the country. So, they've done a better job of managing that issue than I think almost anybody else has in Europe, and I would tell you they're not perfect, and they know that, but nevertheless, that's a logical step. If you look at the United States today, if you look hard at our economy, the underlying fundamentals are not good. Why would you introduce millions of people into an uncertain future inside the United States with an economy that probably can't employ them, and who's coming in? We're already complaining about the terrible quality of American education in public schools. Well, if we're not providing adequate education for our own population so that it can find employment in the future, why are we bringing all of these people in? We don't know who they are or what they want, and we probably can't employ most of them. Now, you do have thousands of Chinese, thousands of Russians, thousands of Ukrainians that have managed to come in. In some of those cases, they may be employable, but we don't know. We also don't know why they're here at all other than, well, we'd like to come in and live in the great consumption machine. Well, I understand that, but where are we going to put them? What are they going to do? Our nuclear power plants are not all perfectly secure. It would not be very difficult for someone inside the United States to sabotage a nuclear power plant. Imagine the level of emergency and alarm that would provoke inside American society. We haven't had that problem yet, but that doesn't mean we couldn't have it. We don't know who's here. And this is the stupidity of saying, well, we have to be prepared to fight the Chinese really. People 10,000 miles away. You want to go to war with them. Why don't you close the border? Why are you admitting thousands of Chinese to our universities, to our laboratories, to our production facilities? I mean, in my judgment, if you're worried about the theft of your intellectual property, stop that. But why would you want to go to war instead? It's sheer lunacy. Makes no sense at all. And as my Japanese and Korean business partners have told me in the past, Chinese are not doing anything today that they have not done for centuries. The diaspora has always sent back whatever they could find that might be useful to the home country. What a surprise! But we don't need to make it easy for them, and we have. Speaking of domestic concerns, you've said that you don't think Biden's going to even make it to the election. You've also talked about a banking crisis, and you've alluded to that now. Internally, America has serious problems in the next 12 months. Can you expand on that? Nassim Taleb, some of your viewers will know who he is, a very brilliant man. Yeah, he was the man who developed this whole concept of the Black Swan event that is mentioned routinely these days, and just a couple of days ago, he was asked similar questions, and he talked about the potential for financial instability and collapse. Another return to what happened in 2008, only worse because we could not necessarily bail out everyone 100% on the dollar as we did back in 2008. He talked about the fact that we've been using monetary policy to address serious structural problems. You know, if you've exported your manufacturing base and you've walked away from systematically exploiting and developing agriculture to the extent that we can, if you've abandoned the energy sector and let it atrophy so that we've got a handful whereas years ago we had several hundred, then you're setting yourself up for an inevitable failure. Somebody said, well, when is this all going to happen? When will it happen? He said, I don't know. He said, well, this could go on for 5 years or another 10 years before the end. He said, well, it seems unlikely, so I think it's in front of us. I think he's right. You know, he pointed out that if you look at the Federal Reserve in structural terms and in terms of what it has on its balance sheets, it looks a lot like the Valley Bank that just went out of existence. Now, the Federal Reserve moved quickly on that, and I'm glad they did. They forestalled a wider emergency, at least for the moment, but I think more of that is likely to come. Remember, all of our banks, small and large, and I think you've got this problem as well as many of our friends around the world and partners. We've sold a lot of people treasuries, which were always considered a good hedge at very low interest rates. The interest rates are and are likely to continue to rise. People say, well, if it gets out of hand, the Fed can suppress it. But there's a growing chorus of people warning that that may not be possible. So then suddenly, you're paying exorbitant prices to service your debt. I always point out that the British left India in 1947 when their debt-to-GDP ratio was 240%. That was largely because we bankrupted Great Britain during World War II because the British essentially sold everything to participate in this war against Nazi Germany that ultimately turned out to be a great victory for Soviet Russia but not for Great Britain. Well, the point is that the British experienced this, and they took in the facts, and they made a prudent decision. We've got to get out, and they got out. Well, that's what you're going to see happen to us, I think, in the near term. That's why I kind of referred to this business of adding Sweden and Finland or anybody else to NATO as well. You're buying a ticket, a berth if you will, on the Titanic, and it's already struck an iceberg, and they don't seem to get it, but we can't fund it all. We can't afford it all. Europeans can't either, or they won't in many cases, so that everything is going to change. But somebody said the other day, nothing matters until it does. It's back to the something goes on until it can't. I mean, that's where we are at the moment. We know that we're crossing this rickety old bridge and that the bridge is destined to collapse, but everybody says, well, listen, it's held up this long. Let's continue to use it. It's going to be god-awful when that collapses. You mentioned NATO, like what kind of implications are going on there now? You've also mentioned that the Poles and Lithuanians are kind of fired up to take this fight, but nobody else is at this point. You also mentioned the cruise missiles, and in a desperate Zelensky's hands, firing those into Russia could be his last-ditch move. And if you do that, Russia has to respond, and then everything gets escalated and gets more and more dangerous. Well, first of all, the Russians will not use a nuclear weapon unless someone uses a nuclear weapon against them. Explain that because you said that's a sign of weakness to use the nuclear weapon, and they're not in a weak position. Right. There's no reason for them to use a nuclear weapon. They have right now the advantage of overwhelming high-end conventional combat capability. The reason Ukraine still has forces fighting is that the Russians have not decided to attack and annihilate them. That's the thing that will likely happen if these cruise missiles that were promised to Zelensky fall into his hands. His regime is so desperate that they will attack targets inside Russia. Now, I'm sure the Russians will shoot down most of them, maybe only half of them. Who knows? How many cruise missiles have to hit Moscow or Belgorod or Rostov or any other Russian cities before somebody says to President Putin, "Why haven't you stopped this?" And then it's over. Absolutely it will end. As I said, you've got hundreds of thousands of troops in reserve. They're brilliantly equipped. They're very well trained now. You're not talking about the U.S. Army National Guard or the militia or the Saturday night soldiers that people used to joke about in Great Britain. These people are trained. They've been in the military. They're not foreign to it. Now they're assimilated. They're ready to go. So I think that would happen. And that would escalate. Now the question is, what do we do? And that's the question that has always plagued Putin. Because Putin, again, doesn't want a long-term state of war with the West. China doesn't either. China wants to extend this one belt, one road all the way to Europe. As long as Ukraine is disintegrating and in chaos, it can't do it. Everybody wants to get back to that. On the other side, I think there are Europeans who are privately saying, look, this is crazy. We've got to get back to normal too. We can't go on much longer. You see demonstrations in Bulgaria, in Moldova, in Romania, all against this notion of war with Russia over Ukraine. It's not because they hate Ukrainians or love Ukrainians or hate Russians or love Russians. They want to get back to normal. They want this to be over. I think if I look at the polls right now in Poland, I think it's roughly 52% who have expressed a desire to avoid war with Russia. Now, I don't know where their government stands because the government seems to be disconnected from that viewpoint. And you're right, the Poles and Lithuanians could feel the force. I don't know what size it would be that could conceivably intervene in Western Ukraine. And I've tried to tell them when they've asked me. I've had people call from Poland and say, "What do you think will happen?" And I said, well, even though your government stands up and says we're doing this on our own, this is not a NATO event. Russia's going to say this is a Trojan horse for NATO. These people are in NATO. And so again, when the alliance expanded, there were voices inside NATO that said, Eastern Europe is a different place. There are people there with agendas because the outcome of the war did not suit them. In Poland and Lithuania, they used to be great powers. They controlled vast strips of territory. Romania lost territory. Hungary lost territory. I mean, World War I was bad. World War II was worse. So you have all these anti-status quo powers that join NATO, and then what do they want to do? They want to leverage us, the United States and its allies, to pursue their agenda. This is wag the dog on an international scale. It's crazy. We have no interest in restoring the Polish-Lithuanian Empire that existed from 1459 until 1794. At least I don't see anybody willing to suit up in Great Britain or Germany or France. Let's go rebuild it. These people want to do that. That's their privilege. They should get out of the alliance. Leave NATO. Fly to Moscow. I mean, frankly, Putin knows his history well. He has spoken publicly and said repeatedly, "We know that the people in Western Ukraine do not want to be ruled by us. We don't want to rule them. That's not the issue." And then he said they'd probably be happier with the Poles. Well, maybe not. There's not a perfect history of harmony and love there between the Poles and Ukrainians either. But he understands, but right now, that's not the issue. For him, the issue is if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, I've got a permanent enemy camp right across the street on my border. I've got missiles minutes away from all my major cities, and my military capabilities and my deterrent. That's unacceptable. We won't listen. We refuse to listen to the man. We refuse to accept the fact that Russia has legitimate security interests. And until we do that, this will go on. Russia won't stop. So it's really back to where we started. This ball is back in the European court. Because I don't see any evidence right now that anyone in London is going to diverge in their opinion from us. In fact, London may be more vociferous in its advocacy for war than Washington in many ways. Why is that? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, we used to have really sober-minded leaders in London. You know, you had people like Palmerston, Disraeli, even Gladstone, all these people that would have said, "Look, we certainly care about the Ukrainians, we would like to see an end to the war, but we're not going to commit British armies to the field to throw out the Russians, so we have to deal with them and find other ways to reconcile this." I mean, this was the point of the 1879 Congress of Berlin, where the Disraeli and Bismarck plotted together and avoided a war that would have resulted basically in the Russian capture of Constantinople. They certainly understood why the Russians wanted to capture Constantinople. It was the center of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years. They wanted to throw the Muslims out. That's fine, we understand that, but that's not in everybody's interest in Europe, and you're going to create a conflagration on an international level when we're trying to maintain peace, stability, and prosperity. So, the two of them worked together, and it was avoided. We don't seem to have anybody willing to do that. No one's willing to say, "Look, this is really not in our interest." You know what is important to Britain, what's important to Germany? I think the Germans know there's nothing happening in eastern Ukraine that is of vital strategic interest to the German nation. Sorry, it's not there. The French certainly know that. So what is happening in Britain? I don't understand this. It seems as though this globalist mindset that the entire world has to be brought to heel and be assimilated into this world, no national borders, no national identity, world government, and so forth is driving these people. Well, you know, those things are not going to go away. You know, the big joke historically was on the day that the Soviet Union fell. Everybody stood around in Moscow and said, "Well, what happened to all of the Soviet men?" And somebody from the United States said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, the Soviet man, this was the ideal. We were going to build the new Soviet man who had no identity, no cultural identity, no ethnic identity, no religious identity." And they turned around and said, "But that didn't happen. Instead of after 70 years of communism, we have Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Lithuanians, Latvians." You know, the key to peace and prosperity, as Disraeli and Bismarck understood, and I think many understood for many years in Europe, is to accept those things, respect those things. Then you can get along, and you come to arrangements, and they may not be perfect, but at least they end the bloodletting and it gives you an opportunity over time to perhaps fashion something better. That was Metternich. You know, all the men of the past, tail ran. Everybody go back and look at these people that put an end to the Napoleonic Wars and then fashioned new peace agreements. They all thought in those terms. You can't ignore those things. So, you accommodate them, you live with them, and what have we learned in Europe? Once people were secure inside their borders and they were relatively homogeneous after World War II, so that Frenchmen were not at risk in France and Germans were not at risk in Germany and Poles were not at risk inside Poland, people were secure. The borders didn't mean a great deal, did they? That's the more intelligent approach. We've lost an appreciation for it. I don't know where we got lost, but we're very definitely lost at this point. Yeah, it is that globalist mindset and trend, Colonel. Just a couple of things. Both President Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., both running for president, have said they could end this war in a phone call. They would make a phone call to Putin, and they would end this war. Could they, in your opinion? It would depend on the phone call. The phone call would have to say the following. First, we have suspended any further aid to Kiev. No more aid is being sent. Secondly, we are withdrawing all American or otherwise from Ukraine, and we are standing down the forces that are in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia. That would be the precondition. You'd have to say that right up front, and we are dropping our objections to neutrality for whatever Ukrainian state emerges from the talks. The Russians will talk to you, then we can put an end to this, and again, it may not be what everybody wants, but we'll have an end to it and a new arrangement will emerge, and that arrangement will probably work for some period of time, maybe not permanently, but for some period of time. It may have to be adjusted down the line. I think that has to happen. I find it shocking and tragic that a phone call could end something or it could continue at this rate with, I think you estimated 250 to 300,000 casualties and the Ukrainian 300 to 350,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. Wow! That's what people have to understand dead. Hundreds of thousands of wounded. I don't know how many, but I know that some of the wounds are so severe, these people will never return to active duty. I know the hospitals are full. This is a tragedy that needs to end. It makes no sense. Even people on the battlefield are figuring this out. And you know, one Russian commander suggested the war will end because someone in the Ukrainian army who's in command somewhere will step forward and say, enough's enough. He may be right because we've seen desertions from the Ukrainian camp rise precipitously. They're not reported in the Western press, but we've seen platoons and companies. Remember, most of the people on both sides of this divide in southern Ukraine are speaking virtually the same language, and it calls up and says to a Russian counterpart, I can't evacuate my wounded. My commanders won't support it. They won't evacuate anybody. They say we have to fight here and die here. I don't want my men to die. I don't want the wounded to die. So, I'm surrendering, and they say, fine. Leave your weapons. Put everything on safe, drive over here. One of the things that Putin has done with his army is to treat the Ukrainian soldiers very well. So they know they're not going to be abused. They're not going to be killed. And that has not been the case on the Ukrainian side with regard to the Russian troops. And again, no one's being told that truth. The Russians are always blamed for everything that I've seen the Ukraine do. It's tragic, and when I say Ukrainians, I'm saying all, but too many units, too many forces out there motivated by mind-numbing hatred have done terrible things to Russian prisoners and to their own people. You know, these press gangs are now running around in western Ukraine all the way to the Carpathians trying to scoop up manpower and force it to the front. They're having a tough time. People are throwing things at them. They won't help them. They won't support them. This war inside Ukraine has become a catastrophe. I don't think Zelensky really has the support that we impute to him. I don't think he has the legitimacy anymore either. And there are lots of things that keep coming out of radio transmissions and postings on Telegram and other things to suggest that there are many Ukrainians who would like to remove him. Why doesn't the West recognize that the bloodletting should stop? Because no one wants to stand up and say, you know, we were wrong. We made a mistake. The assumptions were wrong. We admit that. This has to end. No one will do that. At least not yet. Certainly not in Washington. Yeah, Colonel, final question. The election next year. What do you expect that we need to be prepared to happen? I mean, we're probably going to have some of those candidates I just mentioned in the mix, whether it's Trump or DeSantis, Kennedy, Biden. You know, if you look back 4 years ago, we had a lot of information technology platforms compromised, mail-in ballots. Coming forward, we're going to have artificial intelligence to deal with deep fakes, misinformation, technology platform hijacking. What do you think this is going to be like October, November next year? Your description fits the coming election, assuming we get there and have won. The problem right now is as follows. What happens to President Biden? We don't know. He could suddenly be removed. In other words, he could simply decide, in consultation with his advisors, it's time for me to retire. In which case, this person Harris becomes the vice president in whom no one reposes any trust or confidence. Then I think the left will try to insinuate this man, Governor Newsom from California, who is an advocate for everything that the rest of us want to stop, open borders, no standards of any kind. I mean, remember, the left has now become the place where there are no standards for anything. No standards in the military. No standards in society. Everything is either racially oriented or culturally oriented in some way. There's no test for competence anymore. No respect for character, competence, and intelligence in the military. That's a catastrophe. And it's getting worse with each passing day. We're about to get a chairman of the so-called Joint Chiefs who openly hates white people and wants to drive white officers out of the armed forces, trying to drive them out of the Air Force. This is ludicrous nonsense. This is insane. And I guess there are large numbers of self-loathing white people who have joined this bandwagon, but that doesn't apply to the majority of Americans by any means. Most Americans want competence-based, merit-based selection for schooling, for advancement, for promotion, for whatever it is, in and out of uniform. So I think there are a lot of things that could go wrong. And the problem with the whole electoral process, and people don't understand this. Our Constitution, which was written in the 1780s, 1787, says the states are responsible for elections. Why would the federal government give them power to decide these things? Because at the time, our federal government was almost non-existent. All the power, money, and authority was at the state level. Well, here we sit. This is a different world. There are no standards again. How do you uniformly manage voting? How do you deal with all the issues that you just mentioned? Mass write-in ballots, mail-in ballots, absentee ballots? All of this is an opportunity for corruption on steroids. And then you have these areas, these cities in the world like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Los Angeles. The corruption there has reached the point of institutionalization. How do you deal with that? You know, the joke has been for a long time, that's the day of the resurrection. Because all come out of the cemeteries and vote. I think it's all true, it's terrible, but it's true. So how do you get a free and fair election? This is a terrible thing to say about my country, but I'm afraid it's true. We're not all stupid, we know this now. That's one set of problems. What happens on the financial economic side, that's another factor. And then finally, what happens overseas in Ukraine? Americans may not be paying much attention to what's happening on a day-to-day basis in Ukraine, but when it collapses and it becomes unambiguously clear that we have poured hundreds of billions into this project, that most of the people that we've been supporting are corrupt and criminals, everything goes to hell in a handbasket quickly in the United States. I think it's the convergence or confluence of these factors that could lead to violence and disorder in America. We already have a big problem with the rule of law, which used to be the most attractive feature of American society.